If you're familiar with the term trend log, then you already know what a history is. We use the term history in N4 to do the same thing your traditional trend log does. Histories allow us to collect snapshots in time. By default, the points that we've added to our station don't have histories or alarms already in them. So we need to extend the functionality of the point that we're going to add a history to by adding an extension. So let me show you what I'm talking about. I am going to open my history palette, and I'm going to expand the extensions folder. You'll notice that for every point type, we have two different types of history extensions available. For these numeric points that are at the top, just using that as an example, I have numeric interval and numeric COV. COV stands for change of value. An interval history extension collects a snapshot or a record every 15 minutes by default, and it keeps 500 of those records. Now that's a default, we can change that. The COV extension will collect a record anytime a value changes by the change tolerance property that we can configure inside of the COV extension. I'm going to add a numeric interval history extension to my space temp point. So you might think that you could just drag the numeric interval onto the space temp on the wire sheet and hit OK. That's not the case. I get an error. N4 thinks I'm trying to drop this extension onto my wire sheet. It doesn't understand that I'm trying to drop it onto space temp. So let me just hit OK to clear this error. Let me double click my space temp to go to its AX property sheet. And then I'm going to take this numeric interval and drag and drop it onto the name of the point in the property sheet. When I let go, it asks me for a name. I'm okay with the default name. I'll just hit OK. And it shows up at the bottom of my property sheet. If I expand this extension, the first thing I see is the status property, and it says that it's disabled. When I add a history extension, it comes in disabled by default. I am going to tell this one to be enabled, and then I'm going to expand the history config, and I'm going to set the record count on the capacity property. This is how many records it will store by default. I'll go ahead and change this to 600, just so you can see the difference. Then I'll collapse the history config, and I'll come down to the interval property, and I'm going to change this from 15 minutes, which is the default. It takes a record every 15 minutes. I'm going to change this 00, and I'll put 10 seconds in there. You may not want a history collecting every 10 seconds in the real world, but I'd like to have some data to look at when I go and view the chart and look at the collections for this particular history. Now, before I save this, I want to show you what happens when I do. So in my nav tree, I'm going to scroll down to the history space, and I'll just expand it. You'll notice that the training station shows up here. And if I expand the training station, all I have is an audit history and a log history. We'll look at these later in the course. There's no other histories in my station at this point. When I hit the save button here, watch what happens in the history space underneath my training 14 station. I have a space temp history now in my history space. If you remember back to when I added the history extension, I told you to leave the name default, so it says numeric interval. So how did it know to name this history space temp? If you look at the history name property, you get your first exposure to a little bit of code. %parent.name% is referred to as B format or % notation, and it tells the history to dynamically name itself based on the relationship it has with the objects around it. Let me expand the nav tree and try and explain this a little bit better. So if I come up to my AHU 14 and I look at the space temp point, if I expand that in my nav tree, there is my numeric interval. What this code is saying is to go up to its parent and give me the name, parent.name. That's how this space temp history got its name. That's about as deep into this code as we're going to get in the class. We cover this extensively in the advanced class. Every object in every space, when I say space, you can think of that as a folder or a container, must have a unique name. In our AHU folder, we only have one space temp, so that's fine. If I added another AHU controller to my station, and it also had a space temp point that I wanted to add a history to, when I try to enable the history for the second space temp, it'll go into default, because I have to have unique names in my history space. There's a couple of ways to work around this. One way is to just come into the history name and type something in there. AHU 14 space temp. Problem I have with this is it's not very portable. If I was to duplicate this air handler, I'd have to come into every single history and physically change all these names. So I'm going to put this back to %parent.name% and try and figure out how to make this space temp a little bit more unique. Now I know that it lives in the AHU 14 folder, and I know that I can't have another space temp point in this same folder. So I'm going to get a little creative with my history name using B formatting. If I take a look at the way that this is now, it says parent.name. So here is my history extension, there is its parent. I would like this space temp history to be called AHU 14 underscore space temp. So if I follow this up the tree, starting here on my numeric interval history, there's parent number 1. If I go up to AHU 14, there's parent number 2. So if I come down here and I type another parent into the B format code, let me scroll down so you can see what happens. I will save this to see what it's going to do. Okay, I got AHU 14 because it walked up the tree. There's my history extension, there's parent, and there's parent. I'm able to get the AHU 14 name, and I'm also able to get the space temp. How do I get them both together? Let me scroll down here. This history name property allows me to string different B formats together. So I'm going to put an underscore here just so that I get some separation in my name. I don't need the underscore, it's not part of the code. Anything outside of the % is just static text. But let me string these together. I have parent.parent.name, that gets me AHU 14. Then I put an underscore, and I'm going to type in %parent.name%. That was the part that we originally had to get us the space temp name. So when I hit save, I have my history called AHU 14 underscore space temp. That's exactly what I'm looking for. This B format is going to be extremely helpful in the real world for all your histories. You may from time to time need to add another parent to go up another folder. Let me look at this again up here. If you have AHU 14 and then a points folder underneath it for some reason, you might need to go up another folder. But if you remember that starting from the history extension, the relationship that I'm looking for is parent.parent. So if I had another folder here, I would just go up one more parent. So let me go back to my air handler wire sheet. I'll hit the back button. And I'm going to add a numeric COV extension on all of my set point objects. And I'm going to change the change tolerance to 0.01. Let me show you how that works. I'll go to my property sheet of my awk_cool set point here, and I will find the numeric COV extension in my history palette and drag it onto the name of the point. I won't rename this. I'll just hit OK. expand my numeric COV, and let me scroll down in my tree so you see what happens. I'll put in my B format. And so I don't have to type this every time. I'm going to select this whole line by left-clicking and dragging my mouse across so it turns blue, and then I will hit Control-C on my keyboard to copy that and put it onto my clipboard. That way, when I go to the next history extension, I don't have to type this again. I'll change the change tolerance to 0.01, then I'll enable my history and save it. You'll notice now that in my history space I have AHU14_awk cool set point. Back to my wire sheet. Do the same thing with unawk cool set point. Drag my numeric COV. Paste with Control V. Set this to 0.01. Enable it. And save. I'll do the rest of my set points off screen, and then I'll show you how to do the Boolean COVs. I've added all the COV extensions to these points. Now I'm going to go into my Boolean points and do the same thing, but I'm going to use a Boolean change of value history extension on those. So double click my fan point, drag over a Boolean COV, expand, put my history name in there. With the Boolean COVs, we're going to leave those disabled. I'll show you where we can go to batch enable them in just a few minutes. Let me save this. See how it doesn't come into the history space? It won't show up here until I enable it. Go back to my wire sheet. I'll do the rest of these off screen. I went ahead and added numeric interval histories collecting at 5-minute intervals to my damper and my discharge air temp as well. Let me go back, and I did not enable any of them. You can see that my history space doesn't have anything new in it. I'm going to scroll up in my nav tree, and I'm going to expand my services folder. And inside of the services folder, you'll find a service called History Service. When I double click the History Service, I end up in the History Extension Manager view, and you'll see that there's some histories in here that are grayed out. All I need to do is select the histories that are grayed out or disabled. You can see the disabled in the status column. With those selected, I can come up here to my icons and hit the play button, and it will enable all of those histories. If I scroll down in my nav tree to my history space, you'll see that those histories are there now. I'd like to view some of the historical information that I've collected, so I'm going to double click on the AHU14 space temp history in my history space, and it will bring me to an HTML5 chart view. This particular history hasn't changed at all since I added it, but it is collecting in 10-second intervals. So as I move my mouse along the line, you can see it's changing every 10 seconds. And I can come up here to the drop-down box and choose what I want to display when I look at this chart. So maybe I want to see the last 24 hours, yesterday, week to date. There are a lot of settings and tools that are built into this HTML5 chart. We'll look at some of them as we proceed in the course. I can hit this little button right here that will export the current view or object. I want to verify that my exporter tool is set to chart, and then my destination needs to be set to station file. That will save a copy of this chart to the file space of my station. Hit OK. Now I can go to my file space, expand the file space. I have a charts folder, and I have this AHU14 space temp.chart. We will use this later. I'm not going to do anything else with it right now. So I'll collapse my file space. When I right click on this AHU space temp history in my history space, there are some other views available. I want to go look at the AX history table. Here's a text view with all of my records available. I can come up here to this exporter tool, and I can export this history table to PDF. And now I have a PDF of all of the histories that were collected on that point. I'm going to go back to my wire sheet. Back again here. Back again. There we go. And that'll prepare me for the next lab.